Welcome to Keto Life Support, where we make your keto life sustainable, fun, and low stress. I'm Kim Howerton, and I'll be coming to you weekly with some of my keto besties to bring you the practical, real-world keto advice that you need. Quick disclaimer, I am not a doctor, and even if we do have a doctor in the house from time to time, he or she is not your doctor, and nothing we say on this show should be taken as medical advice. Always check in with a trusted medical professional about your own personal medical concerns.
Hello and welcome to Keto Life Support. This is Kim Howerton, episode 120. And on this episode, I have some lovely guests, Amber O'Hearn and Siobhan Huggins, both of whom are speakers in the low carb and ketogenic world, and also researchers and smart ladies and just sweethearts as well, good friends of mine. And so one of the things that has happened a few months ago is, as you know, I've done one episode about this, but a woman made a video about how keto had tanked her thyroid and warning any woman over 40 that she should not do keto because it would destroy the thyroid function. And all of us, now Amber and I are over 40, Siobhan has a ways to go, she's a wee youngin', but we all had some strong feelings about this assertion. And I've done an episode, as I said, on this before, but I was trying to be really careful not to share too much direct information. In this, Siobhan and Amber and I got together to discuss some of the findings we found faulty in this video and discussion around it. And we do mention the person by name because it just seemed weird not to at that time. And I found actually when I was like, I'm not naming names, people got more curious rather than less curious. And so do what you will. But please know that we were trying our very best to always be very conscious of the fact that we are not calling a person out. We are calling out information we find off, and information that is off should be corrected, but no one deserves blame, shame, or hate for being wrong. We all have been wrong at one time or another, and we just hope that at some point, whenever we are wrong and we see better information being presented, that we correct ourselves. And we hope the same for everybody in the field, because if we can't be that level of intellectually honest, what good are we, right? So join us for this lively discussion of our thoughts and feelings and some facts about keto and your thyroid. A rebuttal. Hello and welcome. I am so glad to be joined by two of my really good friends. This is Siobhan Huggins. Say hi.
Hello.
And this is Amber O'Hearn. And we're going to talk today about a video that many of you have watched. I've already done a video or two on this topic, but Siobhan and Amber are two of my very smart friends, very good at research and studies. And I thought, let's just talk about it. Let's talk about this specific topic, this specific video that was made about keto tanking your thyroid. And then there was a lot of evidence provided about studies that the person, whose name is Christina, felt was related. And we read them and we want to talk about them and maybe some of the things we feel were, in our opinion, misapplied. So let's just jump in and you can get to know these ladies. If you don't, you probably already know them, but get to know them. So Siobhan, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Siobhan Huggins, like Kim said. I'm actually the research specialist over at the Lipedema Project. So that is a 501c3 nonprofit that focuses on lipedema advocacy and research. But even before that, I've been an independent researcher for like roughly 5 years or something. And basically that just means I read a bunch of studies and I talk about them.
Amber?
Hi. So this topic is actually really near and dear to my heart because I've been on a low-carb diet for, almost half my life at this point, 25 years-ish. And I started a carnivore diet over a dozen years ago. And 10 years ago, I finally bit the bullet and started writing about research on my blog. And one of the very first topics that I wrote about was about this idea that a ketogenic diet is stressful to the body. And it's been actually a recurring theme. So the ideas about thyroid and cortisol and other ways that a ketogenic diet might be thought of as being stressful, it comes up again and again in my work. And so when I saw this video, my first response was, oh no, not again. But I think it's worth talking about again and again, because there are certain things that are right and certain things that are wrong, and getting to the bottom of figuring out which ones are which, I think, can be really helpful.
Yeah, and just as a dietary disclosure on my end as well, I have been on a ketogenic diet for nearly 6 years and on a predominantly carnivorous diet for almost 5 years now. So that does make me biased.
Right. And I was on a ketogenic diet for a good 4.5 years, and then slowly transitioned to what I would call sort of bouncing between keto and high protein, low carb since then. And so all of us have done different things at different times, but I would say you can be pretty clear that all of us have a bit of a attachment, I'll put it that way, to a ketogenic lifestyle. But I think all of us try not to be too dogmatic about it and challenge some of our thoughts. So definitely.
Yeah, well, that's a good point, because it means so many different things to so many different people. And I think that that's where a lot of the confusion often lies.
Yeah, yeah. And I think we're all in agreement because all of us have struggled, right? We've all struggled with weight and, to be honest, mental health issues on some level. And have all of us had thyroid irregularity? I've had thyroid issues. Have any of the two of you?
I suspect that I did before keto.
Okay.
I suspect I was actually hypothyroid when I was obese. And the other aspect is now me and my doctor both suspect I might have some autoimmune thyroid thing, but it's just in remission from the diet. So that's something I have to investigate. It's not confirmed for now.
Yeah, I was on a small amount of thyroid medication at one point before carnivore, which it was more symptomatic than blood work related. Mm-hmm. And then those symptoms went away with carnivore. So I stopped using that.
All right. So the other thing we want to start with is like, this stuff is complicated and we feel for people that are struggling. I don't know if you followed my journey. These ladies have, because I make them. But I don't know, out there in the world, like several years ago, I hit this sort of stall on keto wall, didn't know what to do and had to find my way out of it. Felt like I was like drowning in a sack and I had to find my way out. And so many of the issues raised in her video, I'm like, yes, yes, yes. And then unfortunately, then the conclusions I'm reaching, I'm like, no. So let's talk about it. Where do we want to start, ladies?
I mean, I think some setup is needed here just for her context of where she's coming from, which I think is just important to talk about in itself, because I've heard this from other people. I've experienced it myself. And she mentions in her video, like, people aren't believed when they talk about this, which can be extremely upsetting and unfair. So my understanding is that she had gone on a ketogenic diet and she had lost weight from that, but then she had stalled, started restricting, trying to get things moving again. I think probably all of us here have experienced that and that thought process. And then instead of heading where she was expecting, she actually didn't continue losing weight and started gaining instead. And that's when she ended up having to explore this of what is going on, because this is the opposite of what people are telling me should happen.
Yeah. And like I said, that's super common. My whole coaching career at this point is all about people that stall on keto. My program is called Keto Unstuck for this very reason. So it's not uncommon. And the reason that I think the three of us feel so strongly that we need to make this video and others like it is not because we're like, no, you're wrong. It's because if you...
Only partly.
It's because if you give the wrong answer, or at least you give only the wrong answer, a lot of people won't be helped, right? It'll only help the people that accidentally get helped. And I'm not saying there are multiple right answers. I guess I just feel like it's important that we really like talk about all of this, or else there are going to be a lot of people who are like, well, that doesn't help me.
Right. Like, they could be in the same situation. They try this and it doesn't help or makes them worse, because there are some people who are extremely carb intolerant, and increasing the carbs up to even 60 grams per day, I'm one of these people, has really negative effects. And typically that's related to some underlying health issue that they still have. And so they do need the very, very low carb part, but they're still experiencing this problem of I'm not losing anymore. I'm trying and I'm trying and I'm trying and I'm trying more fasting. I'm trying more restriction. It's not working. And if they only get this answer, they try it, then they're right back where they started, but even more frustrated. So I think it's really important to say this can work for some people. I think her approach can be helpful. And I mean, obviously it can be because she said that it's helping her, but it may not be for other people in different health circumstances, in which case, well, what do they do? And that's kind of what we're going to get into of there is another option here. If you've tried this, if you've tried other things, there are other things still to try. So don't give up yet.
And beyond that, I really do actually want to get into the parts that I think are absolutely wrong and that it's misinformation and harmful to people.
Right.
I really want to make sure that we go into the story of why cortisol is not a problem on a ketogenic diet in the way that Christine has described, and similarly that it's not true that low carbohydrate diets wreck your thyroid. That's completely wrong.
Right. So let me just take us through kind of what I think are the main points made, and then if I miss something, you guys can fill it in. But essentially in this video, the first point that was asserted was that she had read a bunch of studies that looked at children with epilepsy who were put on ketogenic diets and found out through her research that because their thyroid function declined so badly by being put on a ketogenic diet, that it had started to become standard of care that children whose epilepsy was treated with a ketogenic diet were automatically put on thyroid replacement medication. So that was like the starting point of the assertions, which then led to, well, if that's true, then it is true that keto will wreck your thyroid because we see that this is happening. And then from there, it was asserted that the reason that happens is because a ketogenic diet causes a very high cortisol state, and that high cortisol state needs to be combated by eating carbohydrates. Did I follow the trajectory you guys heard as well?
Yeah, that was my impression as well. Okay. And I think just off the starting point, one thing to recognize is that when you're looking at people who have a health condition, you kind of have to look at, first of all, what is the composition of the ketogenic diet? Because there are classical ketogenic diets that are used for epilepsy that are like a piece of bread and a glass full of like canola oil. And that's going to be very different from the types of ketogenic diets that typical people eat. The other question is, does the condition that they have potentially impact thyroid? So for example, you could look at people with lipedema, which is a lymphatic and fat disorder that causes weight gain and fat gain. And many people with lipedema also have hypothyroid, just associated with the condition in itself. So you'd have to separate that, hopefully by getting baselines done. So you know where they're starting before they go on the diet, and then you know where they end up to see what the change is. And then additionally, are they on medication? And if so, what impact does that medication have on what you're trying to look at? Because that could be a confounder in itself.
Right. And, so that ties back to I think the main study that she brings up that made her believe that it's the standard of care to give children thyroid medication, which it absolutely is not. I mean, I have Eric Kossoff's book. He goes through like the standard of care, hundreds of pages on how to correctly do a ketogenic diet for epilepsy in children, and thyroid isn't mentioned once in there. And that's because it's not actually a problem. But that one study that is the most forcefully, the authors actually do say, and I don't blame her for picking up on that, but the authors actually do say, ketogenic diets cause thyroid problems, and we should be looking at that and monitoring that and giving children medication for that. The study is so, I'm sorry to say it, but the study is so poorly conducted with the reasoning. What they've done is they've taken children who are sick with epilepsy, which is an autoimmune disease, which means that it's correlated with other autoimmune diseases, which means that thyroid problems could be a problem in the base population starting right there. Then they're only looking at children who are given a ketogenic diet as a therapy. Right now, and when that was written, as it stands, you don't give a child a ketogenic diet for epilepsy unless they've already tried medications and failed, and usually it's an adjunct. And if you look at the people in the study, They were all children who were on, I think, at least one anticonvulsants, and anticonvulsants seem to cause thyroid problems. And then what they did was they followed these children and measured to see if they were having thyroid problems by two measures, one which is T3, which is a complete other topic we have to go over because it's not indicative of hypothyroid in low carb, and TSH, which may be indicative of a problem, and found that some of these children were having thyroid problems, and then concluded that it was a result of the ketogenic diet. And if you can't see why that's a problem, I think we need to, back up and think about causality and baselines, and I think it should be obvious, is what I'm saying, that's not very good evidence for the claim that's being made.
Right. And when follow-up studies were done, not on that population, but similar studies where they actually measured baseline thyroid and post-implementation of the ketogenic diet, they didn't see those shifts. The assumption is a lot of these kids coming into this diet, just to emphasize what you said, were already either fully hypothyroid at that point or were on their way to becoming that way. And I actually followed up with Eric Kossoff, who, if you guys don't know, is sort of like the head honcho about ketogenic diets and epilepsy for children. He's at Johns Hopkins, very reputable institution. And I said, hey, is this true that this is a standard of care, that kids are put on thyroid meds? And he's like, absolutely not. I was like, well, do you monitor? He's like, no, like we monitor kids' health in general, but it's not thought of as an increased risk. And if it was, we would absolutely monitor it, but it's not.
Yeah. And unfortunately, I don't know of any studies of looking at people who are hypothyroid from the start and then they go on ketogenic diets and what effect that has. But I talked to Brian Lenskis a while ago because this is relevant to the lipedema aspect. What he sees in patients who are hypothyroid at baseline, and then he puts them on a ketogenic diet. And he said, generally, they lose fat, they gain lean mass, they have more energy, and their lab work improves. So it's at the very least not harmful and potentially beneficial, at least from one clinician's perspective of what he's seeing in his patients. So it's anecdotal, but we would expect to see this happening all the time, although I understand one aspect of this is over the long term. So what's happening over the long term?
So I think for the first point that we can just say, there is not evidence that seems to support it at this time based on all the studies that were given to us in the original assertion and all the studies I could look for and try to find. Yeah, I was looking like, is there more? Maybe I missed something. And I can't say that I haven't missed something, but I didn't find anything.
Yeah. And I've looked through this exact same topic a while ago, like I said, and I didn't find anything either. I was hoping I could find something of looking specifically at hypothyroid or looking at, I don't really like the term well-formulated ketogenic diet, but a normal person ketogenic diet on thyroid function. And there's not
like how people eat ketogenic diet rather than a like shake administered by a hospital, possibly through a feeding tube ketogenic.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So I have delved into thyroid in the past because, like I said, this is one of those claims that comes up over and over again as the kind of pendulum swings over the decades here with ketogenic diets. And there's this conflating thing. So T3 is the active form of thyroid, and T3 really does go down on a low carbohydrate diet. But that doesn't mean that thyroid function has been compromised. T3 is actually one of the functions of T3 is to stimulate gluconeogenesis in between meals so that you have a constant supply of blood glucose. And so if you are hyperthyroid, for example, you've got too much T3, GNG goes up, and it actually looks a little bit like diabetes because you've got too much stimulation of blood sugar. In hypothyroid, you don't have enough of that, and so you may be lethargic because you're not getting enough energy. So if you think about what happens on a low-carb diet, you stop getting so much energy from carbohydrates because now you're getting it from fat and to a lesser extent from ketone bodies themselves. And so if T3 stayed the same, you would actually be stimulating gluconeogenesis without necessarily the materials for that. And what happens is you can actually lose lean mass. So the current state of the art or state of the interpretation is that the reason why low why T3 becomes lower in these situations is in order to preserve lean mass, because you don't want to be telling your body, gosh, we actually need a lot more GNG or gluconeogenesis right now. Actually, there have been studies where if you add a thyroid supplement in that situation, you can actually cause some lean mass compromise. So this is completely functional. It's a mistake to say lowering T3 and any mechanism that is on the way to preventing T3 from getting as high as it was is some kind of reduced functionality. It's not a reduced functionality at all. Looking at TSH might be a better indicator, because TSH is where your brain is saying, we're feeling around for how much energy there is, and it seems like maybe we need some more T3. So if your TSH is normal, that means your brain is not noticing that anything is going wrong. If you've got a combination of low T3 and higher TSH, that could mean you've got an energy problem. And energy is going to be the key to this whole unraveling this whole problem, and why it's not thyroid, and why carbs is not the only answer.
Right.
And to kind of expand on that, because how I explain this to people is that T3 going down on low carb makes sense because thyroid hormones are an energy regulator. And I was talking to Amber about this before, and they're a carbohydrate energy regulator. So they not only dictate how much energy that we can use and all that type of stuff, but also where it is coming from. So with going on a ketogenic diet from a higher carb diet, we're shifting energy sources. So the thyroid metabolism shifts in response. So with any type of signal shift, the question always has to be, is this pathological? Is this relating to a disease state? Do we see issues developing from this? Or is it physiological? Is it a healthy response to a context change that is actually completely appropriate in a healthy person? And what Amber is saying is that this is a physiological response to lower carbohydrate, because the alternative is that we keep getting the signal to continue creating glucose, but we don't have the substrate to do that necessarily coming in from diet or from our own body stores, from glycerol, for example. And so we're getting the signal, our body's going to respond to that signal. We get the substrate from somewhere, and where is that? Lean mass. And we don't want that to happen. We want to preserve our lean mass as much as possible.
Right. There was a point brought up, and this is just a reframing. So you guys know, and I hope the audience knows, how blood lab levels, like normal ranges, are created. They look at the population, current population. The current population is on a high carbohydrate diet. The average American eats something like 300 grams of carbs a day, right? And if we had blood work from our ancestors, if they tested all of their thyroid numbers, right, I bet what we would think of for them as normal T3 levels would look like low carbers, right? Because that would follow. And so kind of the reframe I had in my mind was, what if you thought about it just in a flipped way, which is normal physiology says T3 should be in this range down here. But when you eat a lot of carbohydrates, it causes that range to have to go up to deal with the carbohydrates you're eating. So right now we often say, because we're the outliers, right? The low carbers are the small population. We say, well, when you're on a low carbohydrate diet, your T3 drops. But you could also phrase it, when you're on a high carbohydrate diet, your T3 increases.
Yeah, I love that. It reminds me of a paper that Siobhan brought to my attention several years ago. There's a researcher who was arguing that because T3 levels were likely lower in the Paleolithic, that means that since iodine is one of the components of thyroid hormone, and it is needed for all of that thyroid metabolism, that maybe our iodine requirements were actually lower, and that's why we're seeing this worldwide crisis of not enough iodine in the soils. Maybe actually the soils and the resources were sufficient at that time to support a population that had a base lower thyroid level of usage. I mean, that's theoretical, but it's actually quite compelling.
Right. And so right now, what we're talking about is very theoretical, but it's good to put these thoughts into your mind to think, well, does that make me think differently about this topic? Siobhan?
Yeah, so I wanted to add that like this framing doesn't necessarily mean that high carb is bad either, because we know just looking at different populations and what they're eating, humans can eat a wide variety of diets. So that's not really the question. It again comes back to this pathological versus physiological thing, which is really saying, is this going to lead to problems or is this not going to lead to problems? For many people in human history, high carb is not a problem. And for many people, they can add carbohydrates back, not a problem. So I just want to clarify that point because it can become a big thing. But I do find on high carb, not what we're talking about here.
I mean, compared to these two ladies, I eat an obscene amount of carbohydrates. And so, yeah, I'm totally not anti, carbs in any way, shape, or form. I'm like, if you just want a reason to eat more carbs, eat more carbs. Like that you want to is enough of a reason. I don't have an issue. It's just making sure that everyone feels seen and that what I feel like is true disinformation is addressed.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. I think if you want to eat more carbs, there is your reason to eat more carbs, just like you said. That's exactly what I was thinking when you brought that up. Like, even if you eat them and it causes you a little bit of a temporary problem or whatever, if you're making that decision knowingly, go for it. Like, that's nobody's business but yours.
Yeah. All right. So one thing I wanted to jump back on, because I feel like we put the epilepsy issue to bed. But then the next issue, which we kind of jumped to thyroid, but the causal discussion about it was that the suggestion was that it was high cortisol, that keto is a high cortisol diet, that was the mechanism that was damaging to the thyroid. So I feel like before we'll come back around to thyroid, but let's address cortisol.
So much to say about cortisol.
Yeah.
First,
Amber is definitely the one. Amber could write the book on this one.
Amber's like a horse at the gate. Like she's like, I'm ready.
Let me at him.
Yeah. Cortisol is often called a stress hormone. It's created in our adrenals, right? It's part of the HPA axis. It's integral to us as a human. It's part of our cycles. It gets labeled a boogeyman, sort of like insulin sometimes, right? You're like, insulin bad. And it's like, well, no insulin worse. So cortisol. Yeah. Amber, what would you like us to know about cortisol?
Well, first of all, the name stress hormone makes it sound like cortisol causes stress, but it's a response to stress. It's actually an anti-stress hormone. And if you look at, for example, there's literature about trying to improve longevity, and there's been a lot of experiments with other animals, for example, in rats or other animals, where they do things like caloric restriction or other kinds of restriction, and they find that they are able to improve the health and the lifespan of certain animals, and their cortisol goes up a little bit. Now, because they have the very end result where the animal's healthier and the animal lives longer, they can't say, oh, this dietary therapy is really good for them, but it increases their cortisol, so it's actually probably bad for them. They can't say that because the end result tells the whole story. So instead, they look at that and they apply their knowledge that they have about what cortisol and other corticosteroids are. And they say, oh, actually, the mild to moderate increase in cortisol that happens in these therapies is actually probably part of what makes it so good for them, because it's an anti-inflammatory. It soothes the whole system. and so I find it really funny that similar scientists with they should have the same knowledge, will look at a diet like the ketogenic diet and say, oh, there seems to be a net result of slightly higher cortisol. That's probably bad, when actually it's probably good. So before I dive into that, there are two problems that have been conflated when talking about cortisol and low-carb ketogenic diets. One of them is this idea that cortisol is raised slightly and that this is bad, and that's the part I was just alluding to. And that's also wrong. But there's something that's much more fundamental that gets brought up a lot, and actually one of my very first blog posts 10 years ago now was about this. The idea that in order to maintain blood sugar, you need to have cortisol. So what was actually stated by Christine in this video is that in order to keep her blood sugar from going too low, cortisol has to come in and stimulate gluconeogenesis so that she doesn't have low blood sugar. That's actually just wrong. Cortisol does stimulate GNG. That's not wrong. But that's like saying, like, if I tickle you and you laugh, my tickling caused you to laugh. But if I hear you laugh, that doesn't mean I'm going to guess that you must be being tickled, right? There are all kinds of other reasons. And the reason that normally that gluconeogenesis or that endogenous glucose production goes up and into the bloodstream isn't normally from cortisol. If it gets to the point of cortisol, that can actually indicate a problem. What normally happens is that glucagon and epinephrine sometimes as well kick in as soon as blood glucose gets to be somewhere maybe under 70. You would have to have your blood glucose drop to 55 or under before cortisol comes into play. And that would be indicating that there's some kind of actual problem going on, like you're definitely not making enough glucose by the normal means. And all that is to say that cortisol, like a release of cortisol, is not the normal means of regulating blood sugar. And so that whole idea that the whole time you're on a low carbohydrate diet, managing blood sugar has to happen by all the excess release of cortisol is just not how it happens. And then, if I can just keep going, so I talked about how in the longevity, lifespan increasing studies, they notice a mild to moderate increase in cortisol. And the same thing has been noted in some studies of a low-carb diet. So that would tend to make people say, well, maybe you don't need it for gluconeogenesis, but it's going up anyway. But here we have to get a little bit technical. So when you look at the level of something, the level of anything, there's always two sides to it, right? There's how much is being produced and how much is being used up. Actually, in cortisol, there's how much is being produced, how much is being cleared out, is just metabolized out and urinated away, and also how much is being regenerated. So we have this enzyme, I think it's called 11-beta-HSD, and I don't
remember that.
Yeah, an enzyme is all we need to know. It's an enzyme,
and it is responsible for intraconverting between the inactive form, cortisone, and the active form, cortisol. It's kind of similar relationship to the T3, where cortisol is active. And whenever you have the cortisone being transferred back into the cortisol, that's a regeneration. Mm-hmm. So there was a really cool study by Stimson, I think, in 2007, I think, where they took obese men, and actually this is a study in men, which might be pleasing to the video author who rightly claims that sometimes women aren't being looked at enough. But anyway, this was a study in obese men, and they were comparing a very low-carb, ad-lib, people are eating as much as they wanted diet to a high-carb one. And they kept protein at 30%. And in people with metabolic syndrome, including these men, what happens is production of cortisol goes up and clearance also goes up. So it's like you're making it and you're wasting it. You're making it and you're wasting it. And you can actually see cortisol levels get too low in metabolic syndrome. What happened to these men on the low-carb ketogenic diet is that their enzyme activity for regenerating cortisol went up and their clearance went down. So both of those things, without even producing more, so there's no extra stress on the adrenal glands, right? Just from not wasting it so much and from regenerating it more, their levels of cortisol went up slightly. And so it made the pattern of cortisol use in them look less like the metabolic syndrome situation where it's being wasted and more like a normal person. And so to say that cortisol is going up is really, there can be a lot going on behind that statement. What does it mean going up? Does it mean it's going up compared to the general population in the way that we've just talked about with thyroid levels, like what's normal and what's not? Does it mean that it went up because we had to produce a lot more? Does it mean it went up because we're wasting less? All of these ideas need to come into play. And then the result of it, cortisol, is not a bad thing. It's actually something that can make you healthier in certain contexts. So I just wanted to say that all of these ideas about we need cortisol in a low-carb diet to regulate blood sugar, or that cortisol is somehow bad, none of those ideas are well supported by the literature.
Right. And rounding back to the previous point, which is cortisol, we're not reaching the point where cortisol would come into play here. More likely, what's happening is that the glucagon to insulin ratio in ketogenic diets is just shifting. And that is going to be what's regulating blood sugar, not so much the cortisol. Because, I mean, just even speaking from experience in myself and other people I've seen who are doing even very, very ketogenic diets, like 3 millimoles, 5 millimoles, way up there, the blood sugar is not going down below 70 typically, unless they're fasting. And people don't tend to fast constantly, or at least I hope not. You have to eat at some point.
Right. And that primary homeostatic mechanism is happening with that insulin glucagon sort of dance for cortisol to get called in. I mean, I'm not saying there isn't some cortisol we have cortisol in our body. Cortisol is part of our daily cycle. We have higher cortisol in the morning and we should have lower cortisol at night. It is a very important thing that we have proper cortisol levels, and that means not no cortisol. And so, yeah, there's some cortisol being secreted, but I don't see any strong evidence that it's actually has been looked at in many studies on low carb. And one of them I'll just say that not just one, but a few found in the initial few weeks of a ketogenic diet, of adopting a ketogenic diet, you could argue that some people had just an increase in cortisol production. Now, they didn't probably do enough advanced study to know if that's 100% true, but it's possible that in that 1 to 2 to 3 week period initially going keto, especially this group of middle-aged women compared to a bunch of groups, did see slightly higher cortisol levels. But by week 8, that was gone. And my argument would be, does anyone remember how stressful it was starting keto? Like, do you remember? I was very like, am I doing this right? Is this happening? What's going on? And like numbers, like I was stressing myself out starting and the body doesn't like, I should say the brain doesn't like change, right? So I can't be bothered by something that happened for a week when you were doing something brand new to you, and it's possible, and there's no real detriment to a week of something like that happening, when by week 6 and beyond, that didn't seem to be a problem anymore. And, there's also the point that when you first go keto, your adrenals might be a little wacky because they are part of that salt regulation process in your body, your sodium levels. And we all know that when you first start keto, those levels can get a little confused.
Yeah. And I mean, even beyond that point, even if you're totally whatever about it, like, oh, I'll just try this, whatever. Like, we already know by looking at various studies on ketogenic diets, there is a fat adaptation process that takes about 6 to 8 weeks. So it makes sense that something temporarily shifted and then regulated back out at the end. I mean, there's kidney shifts that can happen even over months. There's a whole lot of stuff that happens in terms of not only keto adaptation, creating ketones, all that type of stuff, but also fat metabolism adapting. You are shifting over to basically the opposite of what you were doing before. And a lot of that, there's a lot going on there. So I'm not surprised with temporary shifts of any number of things. Cholesterol things can be weird during the first 6 months even. Insulin can be coming down over longer periods of time. There's a whole ton of stuff. But then also, to go back over it, like, cortisol isn't bad. So even if there are, like, again, the question is this going to land us with problems or is it not? And that is the question that we actually care about. We don't care what number anything is unless it's going to result in something bad. Like, that's what it comes down to. That's what we're actually caring about. So in terms of cortisol shifts, glucagon shifts, insulin shifts, are we seeing bad outcomes or are we not? And I mean, at least as far as I know, we are not. And ketogenic diets at this point, I think it's like Nina Teicholz or someone who says it, but ketogenic diets are the most studied diet at this point.
Yeah. I think one thing we can look at, just like you said, right, it's looking at outcomes. What do we know is the negative outcome of chronic high cortisol? Like, what do we know happens if like there are some conditions, right, Amber, where somebody might have chronically high cortisol?
Chronically high cortisol is usually associated with metabolic syndrome. So if there's kind of a confused level of thinking, and there's actually a study on this. The one that I mentioned that complained about there being a slightly higher cortisol level, or maybe I didn't mention it. It's in one of my blog posts. Maybe you can link them.
Yeah, I'll put links in.
But what they did was it was through the Boston Children's Hospital. They compared a low-carb diet to a low-fat diet for weight loss, and they showed that everything that they measured, every possible thing that they measured to do with metabolic syndrome, showed that the low-carb diet performed better. But there's this one niggling thing, which was cortisol. I think it was urinary cortisol that they were looking at. And the low-carb diet did slightly worse by their measure in terms of matching metabolic syndrome more. Okay, so to lay it all out, what they're saying is, in every way that we looked at, low-carb diets reduced signs of metabolic syndrome, except this one way, in that cortisol levels were slightly higher. And so maybe low-carb diets are going to cause metabolic syndrome, is basically what they're saying, which makes no sense whatsoever. So all of that is to say, we don't really know what the causal implications would be of having slightly higher cortisol. We only know observationally that people who have metabolic syndrome, who obviously have worse outcomes, also often have, there can be higher urinary cortisol because that's that extra clearance piece, right? Cortisol is measured in all these different ways and measured at different times, so it can become very confusing.
It's a moving target throughout the whole day. It's here, then it's here, then it's here, then.
Yeah. And then I think there's also this confusion that comes in about acute cortisol. So we have this like very famous fight or flight stress response, right? And what can happen then is all kinds of different hormones can happen. Cortisol might come into play in order to release a bunch of glucose so that you can fight or run away, right? But that's a very different thing. Like an immediate, short-acting bit of cortisol is very different from your level of cortisol got a little bit bigger and is staying that way over time. Right. Frankly, I think there's no way to know what would be the long-term effect of somebody having slightly higher cortisol, because all we can look at is a sort of retrospective. These people had higher cortisol and these were their outcomes. And if their higher cortisol was a result of some condition, then we can't say anything about high cortisol from some other cause, what that would result in.
Right. I mean, mechanistically, I think we can say that the body using cortisol to manage as its primary, I'm not saying it's not anywhere in the body, but as its primary blood sugar management system is like burning down your house as your primarily heating and cooling system. It's not the right tool, and your body, I don't want to say your body is smart because I always think that's stupid, but all of these systems are kind of brilliant in that, when high levels of cortisol is released, it's designed that's in a very high stress situation, and it spares more glucose for your brain. And if you're constantly pushing that lever, it's going to pull it out of your muscle. It's going to degrade your body. Well, that's not a good long-term strategy. And our bodies have evolved to survive. And I think whenever something just like that doesn't make sense as a survival mechanism, you kind of have to question if what you think is happening is happening.
Yeah, and the other aspect of this is that commonly when you look at things in the body, or at least when I look at them, it's not infrequent to see something being used for multiple things. Right. And that can be simultaneous. So ketone bodies, for example, signal a whole bunch of stuff all at once. But also it can be used for different things in different contexts, which is where other signals are coming in, like what is your insulin level at that time? just insulin in general, for example. Insulin is used for a ton of things in the body. And one of those things is carbohydrate metabolism, but it can also be involved in immunity, for example. Insulin resistance and the immune system are very tightly linked together. But that isn't to say that, we know a lot of chronic conditions and all these things relate to chronic hyperinsulinemia, but that isn't to say that a temporary shift in insulin from eating carbohydrates is necessarily bad. It depends entirely on the context and what is causing that signal. And if it's a sustained signal where normally it isn't, why is that? What is the overall context? Because it could be that that thing is elevated and that's associated with bad outcomes, but it actually has nothing to do with that marker itself. It could just be that the overall context is bad. Like one of these other things that we can look at is inflammation. Constantly gets a bad name, just talked down, really bullied a lot, and I don't appreciate
that
it.
insulin or that inflammation.
Yeah, that inflammation is such a demon. And people will sometimes do these things. Well, okay, chronic inflammation is bad, but acute inflammation is good. It's like, well, okay, well, look at the context here. Like inflammation is a signal. It is saying something is going on here. If you have an acute inflammatory response, that necessarily means it's resolving itself. Something happened and then it stopped happening and you got over it. A chronic inflammatory response does not necessarily mean there's anything wrong with inflammation in itself. I mean, that's a massive topic, but it could just be that your environment is not good and you're necessitating this inflammation all the time. So we really do have to look at context.
Right. Which I think is the argument that cortisol, if a ketogenic diet does raise your cortisol levels a little bit all the time in a long-term sense, then the argument is, oh, does that mean that something bad is going on at a background level all the time and that's why your cortisol is higher? Someone could make that argument, but I would go back to the increased lifespan animals and say, well, no, here's a situation where cortisol levels are higher than the baseline and they're better off. And so you can't necessarily deduce that it's indicative of requiring constant anti-inflammation.
Yeah, I think the central point too that I want to make is we're all a little bit unique. What someone's level of baseline cortisol that's healthy for them is a little bit different than another. So when we're looking at, the curves is similar, but these aren't fixed absolutes. So what that means to me is the first question to answer is like, does being carbohydrate restricted cause levels of cortisol that are deleterious, that cause problems to the body, which includes damaging the T4 to T3 conversion? That's a separate question of like, might one person's cortisol levels do a little of this and a little of that and a little, that's very individualized. And so that might be true, that's something to monitor. I think the sort of confounding aspect here also might be about cortisol is we do know that when people don't sleep enough and are very stressed in a state of mental distress, their cortisol is up. It becomes triggered by that. And I don't know about you, but at various times when I've been dieting and wanting to lose weight and frustrated that I wasn't losing the weight that I wanted to, that was a very stressful time in my life. And so a lot of people on ketogenic diets are in that mental space, just to bring up the point.
Well, not only that, but if you're frustrated by a ketogenic diet not working, then you could be in a specific environment there may be a reason why it's not working. That may also relate to why you're getting so stressed in the first place.
Right. This is an excellent segue, I think, because the whole context of this problem is Christine is feeling that she and other people that she knows are not being heard about the fact that the more they reduce energy, the less benefit they seem to be getting. And so she started looking at why might this be so? Why is my diet not working for me? And she found these ideas about thyroid and about cortisol that I think are misguided. It's the wrong interpretation of what's happening. But that doesn't mean that she wasn't experiencing a problem.
Right.
But I think there's a very different explanation for the problem that's going on in people who are on a highly restricted ketogenic diet who cannot seem to lose weight and seem to be getting sicker and sicker and having these symptoms that are associated with low thyroid, such as fatigue and cold and tiredness.
Hair loss.
I said fatigue. Yes, all of those things. And so I'm just going to come right out and say it.
Say it.
Energy. You're not getting enough energy. And the fact that you can add some carbs back into your diet and relieve those problems should be no surprise. But it turns out there's another way to get energy that is perfectly compatible with a ketogenic diet, and it's called fat.
Yeah. So let me also emphasize, like, this scenario, like, you are restricting more and more, you're fasting more and more, you're increasing protein more and more, all of that, and not losing weight. I 100% believe you. I have experienced this myself. I know other people who have experienced it. So we are not dismissing that this is a thing. This is absolutely a thing. It doesn't happen to everyone. It happens to some people, but those people need to be heard and not dismissed and not told they're not complying, not told that they're not trying hard enough. Like, they do need to be listened to, because this is actually teaching us very important things about the body and how it responds to certain situations. Problems do need to be resolved, not saying, oh, you're an outlier, we don't need to talk about it.
Your body just doesn't work the way we want it to, so we're not going to work with you.
Yeah. And to Amber's point, like, yes, like, here's the central point. There are two different forms of energy that we can use primarily. I mean, you can talk about ketones, but we're talking about fat or carbs. So if it is an energy problem, then it makes total sense that if someone can add carbs and they can use those carbs for energy in a healthy way, then it will help with this problem. But on the alternative side, you can also try adding fat and it may also work. That is what I came to. I've talked to other people through this when they've tried things and they haven't worked, and they kind of finally came to this conclusion of, okay, maybe I'll try higher fat. And that's what helped get them there. Like, not eating enough is a problem. And it's not necessarily an issue. It can become an issue, is that hunger signals on keto can be very different from hunger signals on high carb, because it may be that you don't have this immediacy. Like, oh, you can access your fat stores a little bit, so it may express itself as fatigue or feeling cold or not wanting to go out on that walk that you usually do, or down regulation of a whole bunch of weakness. Exactly.
Irritability.
Yeah, irritability, being cranky.
I'm not angry.
Man, and that's the funny thing too, is that sometimes you can be in the situation of, man, I'm so irritable, like my life is so stressful. And then sometimes I'll be in that space and I'll be like, am I eating enough? Is it that my life is actually stressful, or is it that I'm struggling with the normal responsibilities of my life because I'm in an unideal state for me?
And I think that sometimes when you reintroduce a lot of, or any degree of carbohydrates, especially starchier ones or sugarier ones, you do get that burst of energy. Well, a lot of people do. You feel that faster. And when you've been in a state of more restriction, you can be like, oh, I feel better. Where fat would have a similar effect, but it might happen slower. And I just think, I'm not against people adding carbs if they need more energy. I think for some people, it's good in that some people do get such depressed hunger signals on keto that I struggle. Like, I might struggle to get them to eat more than 800 calories in a day, but I start giving them more carbs, their hunger returns. It's a tool, right? Because
it can work as a litmus test. Right. If you add carbs and so thing improves, try adding fat over a couple of weeks and see if it does the exact same thing over a slower time period. Because I did an experiment of higher fat carnivore over about 3.5 weeks, and it did take a couple of days for me to get the energy boosting and stuff like that. And it's important to talk about these two options because, yes, while adding carbs can work for some people, there are many people where they simply cannot do that. They have medical conditions where they cannot add carbohydrate. That could include mood disorders. It could include epilepsy. It could include lipedema. And it can wide range of things. So people need to understand that there are options and not every single option is going to work for every single person. And so if you do have a severe health condition, or let's say you're on a ketogenic diet and you're still actively hyperinsulinemic, actively diabetic, adding carbohydrates may not be the ideal thing. It may not be what is helpful, and it may even make certain things worse in that case. But there is an alternative. So if you've been in this situation, you've tried adding carbohydrates, made things worse, didn't fix anything, or it did help, but it caused other issues, you can also approach this from the other direction. Okay, this is an energy problem. There's a not enough energy problem. So we're going to add energy, a very efficient energy, and address it that way instead, in a way that's not going to cause problems.
Right.
Tell us about your thyroid and high fat experience, Siobhan.
So this is something that has happened multiple times. So if it were just a one-off, it'd be like, oh, whatever, it could be a coincidence. But I've shifted back and forth multiple times, and it appears to be consistent so far, which is, so for background, before I went keto, I was obese, 240 pounds, metabolic syndrome, very unhealthy person. And I did appear to have, at least going by TSH, which is not perfect, appeared to have some hypothyroid issues there, which would track because I did have difficulty losing weight when calorie restricting. I was very fatigued, depressed, not very motivated in general, didn't feel well. And so when I went on a ketogenic diet, it kind of stayed consistent with that. I had another check-in when I was on an omnivorous ketogenic diet, still kind of in the same range. I went carnivore and still in the same range. That was a higher protein carnivorous diet. But then I went high-fat carnivore and it went down, like below 2, 1.75-ish, as opposed to nearly like 4. It's like, okay, that's interesting.
Kind of from what a functional doctor would say, that seems too high, to what most functional doctors would be like, well, that's not so bad.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that was correlating with things like having more energy, losing more weight, all that, like feeling better in general, wanting to go on more walks, wanting to go on hikes. And then occasionally I would go back to high protein carnivore because it's just like a reduction to the mean, regression to the mean type of thing. My fat would slip lower, or I'd go on a higher protein thing. And I have blood work from then as well, and TSH went back up again. It's like, oh, okay. So then I went back to higher fat and back below 2 again. It's like, okay. So, and the other aspect of that is the higher protein carnivore for me is less ketogenic. It's still ketogenic, but more around 1 millimole, 1.5. And the high fat carnivore that I do is very, very high fat, like 2 to 1 fat to protein by macronutrient gram, basically 80-20 or 85-15 type of thing. So it's highly ketogenic, more around the 3 to 5 range or 2 to 3. But yet it was kind of the opposite of what would be suggested here. It almost seemed like more energy was helping thyroid function, both in how I felt and the blood work as well. But that would track with what we're talking about, where this may not be a carbohydrate issue. It may actually just be an energy issue. And for me, the higher fat is preferable to higher carb because I do have medical conditions that just don't mesh well with carbs.
Right. I think,
and it's not just you.
Go ahead.
That's what's found in the Paleomedicina group as well. They've reported that their method of carnivore, which is very much lower protein and higher fat, they at least claim that their thyroid results are better, and their LDL is also lower, which would be consistent with the energy model, not to divert the topic. But when you are providing enough energy, a lot of these problems that people are seeing with a calorie restricted or a fat restricted low carb diet seem to go away.
Yeah. And I've heard this from someone else who's done very high fat carnivore as well, that they had higher TSH. They were also having difficulty losing weight. They went high fat carnivore instead of high protein, and the TSH came down and they started to lose a little bit of weight. So this is anecdotes being reported, but it's consistent with this idea that it's an energy issue.
Right. I think there are knowns and unknowns, right? Like with many things. There are a few knowns, like very well knowns. And one of them is, it's not really debated that extreme or even just long-term caloric restriction, energy restriction, causes poor thyroid function. in a lot of people.
Yeah. Starvation hypothyroid. That is what that is.
Right.
Your body is getting the signal, we don't have enough energy.
Turn all the processes down.
Yes, crank everything down, because our number one priority is actually to survive. And running out of energy and running through all your energy is not really conducive to that. Now, the interesting thing is that this also applies to people who are obese. So the question is, well, why can't they energy restrict? And then they just access their own energy stores. And there are multiple things. Even if you have a lot of stored fat, there are multiple things that can impact how well you can actually use that energy, how well you can access it, and how well you can use it. So one of those things is insulin resistance. Right. There's a whole bunch of deranged metabolism in insulin resistance that can influence this, including hyperinsulinemia, even insulin resistance within the muscle. Lots going on there. There's also conditions which can impact the health of your fat, like lipedema. One of the things that happens with lipedema is that the fat tissue becomes heavily scarred. And that may mean that you can't access that. So even if you're restricting calories, well, too bad. Like you can't get to it anyway.
You can't have this.
Yeah, we have case studies of women with lipedema who have gone through bariatric surgery, who have starved themselves to emaciation, and the lipidemic fat isn't going anywhere, or at least for the majority part. The other aspect is, even in simple obesity, classic obesity, whatever you want to call it, there can be this almost callousing of the fat. So it's not quite to the point of extreme scarring to where it's not going to be reversed even if you starve yourself. But it is fibrosis of the fat, so this buildup of the connective tissue. And there is work looking at that in people who are obese going through weight loss surgery, and a higher proportion of that in the fat is correlating with less weight loss from that weight loss surgery. So even if you have a lot of fat, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can access it, which means that if you do calorie restrict or energy restrict, that may not be appropriate for you, because your body is saying, this is a problem. We're going to crank everything down. And then there can be longer term consequences from that, where even if you do shift to a ketogenic diet that isn't calorie restricted, there still may be some time and recovery from that where you need to be at not even normal levels of calories, but higher to help correct that and normalize it out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've experienced both situations where I've been able to fast and my ketones immediately went way up, and I felt that almost that euphoria zen that people describe when fasting. So I could tell I've got really good access to my energy right now. It's just all these different ways I can tell. And then other times, there was a time in particular a couple years ago where I was quite ill, and I was trying to instigate a faster fat loss. And so I tried fasting, and I didn't have that response at all. I got cold, I got tired, and I actually caused myself an amenorrheic episode where I didn't menstruate that month. I'm pretty sure I'm getting close to menopause, but I'm pretty sure it was actually caused by the fasting, because my body just perceived, it was as if I was one of those people who is so lean that they're no longer able to support reproductive functions. My body was saying to me, like, you don't have, even though I have all this fat, to my body, I didn't have it.
Right. Yeah. The body was like, oh, this is not good. This is not the time to have a baby. And we'll actually see that in people who are on ketogenic diets or carnivorous diets. One of the things I'll see in women is they'll comment, why have I lost my period on a carnivorous or ketogenic diet? And my first question is, how many times are you eating and how much are you eating? Because usually it comes down to they're doing one meal a day when they're already on the leaner side, or their body thinks that they are, or they're just not eating enough in general over multiple meals, in which case the answer is eat more, and specifically eat more energy. Because I don't care what you're doing. If you are a reproductive age woman and you're all intact in there and you're losing your period from something that has to do with diet, I don't like that.
It is a bad sign. I mean, anyone who suggests that for anything but convenience, it's a good thing, I think misunderstands the signals we need to know that our bodies are healthy. Yeah. I mean, for me, like several years ago, I guess this was probably at this point, almost 3 years ago, 2.5, something like that. These years have been weird. They're, the past few years, I don't know time, but about 2.5, 3 years ago, I finally hit the wall where I was tired of not losing weight. Like I'd lost a bunch of weight on keto and then just plateaued and was super frustrated and couldn't figure out what's going on. And it took me quite a while to really understand that I was needing to do something called a reverse diet, which is just an intentional period of, using the word intentional here, because it's not a free-for-all binge fest, but a intentional period of pushing how much I was eating up, because my body had sort of, I often will say, like, if you're dieting down and you're just like, keep going down the stairs, eventually you get to like the cement floor of the basement, and you're like, but I still have body fat. And you're like, you are in the basement. Where are you going to go? So you have to go back up, because chronic restriction for too long, bodies don't like it.
Very apt. Yeah. Bodies don't like it. It's a good way to put it. And the thing is, like, your body goes off of signals. But the good thing is that whatever your body is doing, you can usually learn a lot from what it is telling you, because it will try very, very hard to communicate with you. So there's this kind of profile of people who it's like, if you try and fast and instead of getting that zen or that lack of hunger that kicks in after a while, you actually get hungrier, or it feels like you are actually starving, that's a sign. The other thing is, if just in general you feel fatigued and cold and just kind of a little bit moody or irritated, maybe that's another sign. Insomnia is another one. So that had actually come up in this video as well. If you are getting insomnia on a ketogenic diet, it's because I think it was something like your cortisol is too high. Amber has done a very wonderful talk on sleep and ketogenic diets. And one of the things was that regulation of sleep also goes hand in hand with satiety and energy regulation. So Amber, please take it so I don't misstate something and sound stupid.
Yeah, no, I'm sure you would never, but...
No, that's my job.
It turns out that the regulation of satiation and sleep are tightly connected and even have like overlapping mechanistic pathways, such that if you eat too little, you are going to sleep less or have trouble sleeping. And if you eat more, your sleep duration or your sleep intensity can go up. So if you're having insomnia on a ketogenic diet, I now consider that, based on what I know about sleep, I now consider that to be potentially a sign of undereating.
And people have commented to you during the Q&A where you gave that talk at Low Carb Boca. People were like, well, when I add carbs, I sleep like a baby. Carbs are energy.
Yeah.
You can add a different form of energy if that's happening, and it may actually fix your problem as well. And that's another aspect is I myself, and I know other people who've had this experience, had insomnia before a ketogenic diet, like to the point of staying up for 48 hours at a time. Not pleasant. Don't recommend it. And when I went on a ketogenic diet, that largely corrected. And now whenever I have bouts of that, I'll either eat more. It's not to that extent anymore, but let's say I'm lying in bed and it takes more than 30 minutes to fall asleep or something. Then I'll use that feedback to eat more the following day. Or just last night, I actually took exogenous ketones because I was having leg pain and that was interrupting my sleep. And so I did that and then slept like a baby. Didn't interrupt my sleep at all. It actually helped me get to sleep.
That's a really interesting one, because the exogenous ketones, if it were the case that ketosis itself was a sleep disruptor, that would not happen.
Right.
But it's actually, it has nothing to do with being in ketosis. It has to do with this conflation. And it's partly that a lot of what we know about ketosis comes from fasting studies or from fasted animals. And so it kind of stands to reason that we will have these conflations that we have to work out. But it turns out that humans don't have to undereat to be ketogenic. So that's very handy.
Yeah, it's a cool thing about humans, but also very frustrating in terms of research, because we're really excellent at fat metabolism and specifically ketogenic metabolism. So rats, they suck at it. Right. You have to severely protein restrict or severely calorie restrict, which introduces all sorts of issues. Like I've talked about this with my colleague Dave, like, oh, it'd be great if we could get like migratory birds or like something like that to kind of help mimic this, because if we're looking at other animals, well, they're just not as cool as us. Well, they're cool
sadly,
in other ways.
People don't
but
let you dissect them as much as you can with other animals.
That's the other issue. You have a little bit of restriction on how you can dissect people. Let's
jump back. So I think what we've so far, just to keep us on the track, is epilepsy, check, not really a thing. Well, I mean, epilepsy is a thing. I mean, the assertions about ketogenic diets for epileptics causing big problems. The cortisol connection, I think we've established, is not really there. And obviously, cortisol is a huge issue, and we can go very deeply into it. But cortisol might be affecting people, but it doesn't look like, in our opinion, the ketogenic diet is the trigger. If you want to re-summarize anything I said, you can. And then, so the third point was that the T4 to T3 conversion is negatively impacted by keto. We touched on that quite a bit. Is there anything we didn't, I kind of interrupted us on the thyroid part?
I think we pretty much covered it. I mean, the main thing is that it's energy regulation and specifically carbohydrate metabolism regulation. Yeah. And I think we've pretty thoroughly covered this. Another thing I actually wanted to mention is that there's a study mentioned in here where they had 800 calorie, very low carbohydrate diet, and they isocalorically swapped in some sugar. So they kept calories the same. I'm presuming they swapped out fat and added sugar, and their T3 went up and their resting metabolic rate went up. But it's important to note that, again, this is a confluence of things. So the glucose is sending the signal of we're using more glucose, increased gluconeogenesis, all that type of stuff. But then you're also in this hypocaloric state. And we can actually see this in the, the Minnesota starvation experiment as well. That's not to that level. I think it was something like 1,500 calories in those men. And what ended up happening, that was a high carbohydrate starvation diet. And they ended up wasting muscle because you're sending this signal, we're using this, do this thing, but then you have to get the substrate from somewhere. And if it's not coming from diet, or if not enough of it is coming from diet, that could send the wrong signal. Like, sure, you might lose weight, but that weight may actually be muscle, which is not ideal.
Right. Yeah. That's not the equation you want to set up.
Yeah. It's like you're sending mixed signals at that point.
Yeah.
Use fat, but don't use fat.
Right. Yeah. And there's, when we look at this, right, the average person with hypothyroidism in the world is on a high carbohydrate diet. The average human who has any problem is on a high carbohydrate diet, because it's just the way these things go. But I think most of us, myself, I was diagnosed with hypothyroidism on a high carbohydrate diet. So I think we can establish that just high carbohydrate does not protect your thyroid. Right. And you have to look at the body function as a whole, the whole metabolic picture, because that is going to be communicating with all your hormones. We're not a closed system, right? Everything is communicating. And so you can't look at things in isolation and say, well, that is no, you have to look at it all together. And I think the ultimate test of is everything working all together is, how do you feel? Your T3 is lower, but I've never had this much energy and my feet aren't cold for the first time in my life. Well, then that marker, you don't treat to markers, you treat to symptoms and conditions. And so I think I feel very strongly, and I feel like you guys feel the same way because we're friends and we think the same way.
I disagree with my friends all the time.
I'm kidding.
In this case, I do agree. Yeah.
Is that the problem is really extended energy restriction. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And carbohydrates being a form.
Yeah. And again, to reiterate, this is worth talking about. This is absolutely important to talk about. If you are experiencing this, we're not saying, oh, ignore it, whatever. We're just saying, no, really dig in and ask, what is the problem that you are experiencing? How are you feeling? Okay, now let's talk about what might be causing that and the different options that you might have. And then you can pick the one that suits you best. I know people who do well on high carb diets. I know people who don't. I know people who do well on low carb diets that aren't ketogenic diet. It's a spectrum. We humans live on a spectrum, which is great because it gives us options most of the time. And Yeah, I'm glad she has brought this up because it's something I've been talking about a lot. I'm frustrated as well of people not acknowledging this problem that pops up in some people. And for those people, they're not an outlier. That's the only body that they can live in. They don't get a choice.
This body doesn't suit me.
Yeah, I'm just going to swap it out and pick another one. Fortunately, not the way it works, but I appreciate the way that the community can come together and acknowledge that not every solution is right for every person. And if we really look at things, we can learn a ton about metabolism and metabolic health and how to help people. Because I think that's what everybody wants, is not to be right, although that's nice, it's to help people.
Yeah, totally.
But having carbohydrate introduction solve a problem doesn't mean that it can't be solved another way.
Yeah, and I think, when I look at Amber and when I look at Siobhan, when I went on a ketogenic diet, at first, it was very essential for me to keep my carbs restricted. I was very insulin resistant, and I was trying to get into a more metabolically healthy place. And when I hit my big stall, all of my markers showed that I was then metabolically healthy. I just weighed more than I wanted to. And I had to, at that point, make a decision if I was going to try and figure out how to weigh less or, just accept where I was. And I guess I want to say, either one would have been an equally valid choice. It just was about what I wanted to do. And so what ended up working out best for me was a higher protein and actually a slightly higher carb diet. Not because, and when I say slightly, I'm not talking exceeding 100 grams. It's still a low carb diet for the average person, but was because in balancing my hunger and energy needs, I was suddenly finding more satiation from vegetables than I used to. And so it was a process for me of finding the sweet spot of being more satisfied. And I started finding vegetables more satisfying than I used to. When I was first keto, you could feed me pounds of broccoli and I would still be starving. But suddenly I found, this small salad or serving of vegetables with my meat made me more satisfied. So that's why I reintroduced more carbs. But if I suffered negative repercussions from the carbs, I would find another way. Right. Because I think both Amber and Siobhan would, in my position, if they added those carbs in, they would have had negative repercussions.
Yeah, and I have experienced that personally. Carbs do not work for me. I have done carb experiments and high carb experiments, and with the conditions that I have, I am metabolically healthy at this point, or at least a lot closer than I used to be. Blood work all looks great at this point. But there is the aspect of I do have chronic conditions, and they really benefit from not only lower carb, but the higher fat aspect as well. I've played around with this a lot. And what I ended up coming to was not only a carnivorous diet, which is low irritant, which is good for me, lower carb, which is good for me, but also the higher fat really leveled up and helped with actually getting satiated at meals, staying full, having more energy. So we went sort of different directions, but ultimately it was things that worked best for us.
Right.
And that's going to differ depending on the person and personally preference. Me personally, I don't like vegetables. I just don't like them. And so even if I had the flexibility, I personally wouldn't choose to reintroduce them just because I don't find them that entertaining. But I think Amber might.
I love vegetables. Plants. Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised if one day in the future I will find that I'm able to tolerate something and decide to eat it, because vegetables, I was brought up mostly vegetarian, and vegetables were just what food was to me for a really long time. But I like the fact that you've emphasized that you can change, your body health might change, and that to play around with what new diet might be better for you at a given time is also worth looking into.
Right. Yeah. I think, I know we're all just telling the stories, but 2 years into my keto journey, I tried higher protein, lower fat, and I felt awful. I felt terrible. My mental health problems increased, my depression increased or came back. It had been pushed aside and it was back. But then now I can eat less fat than I was even doing then, and I feel perfectly fine. So just to reiterate, our bodies can change over time, and it pays to stay curious.
Yeah. And so we kind of started out from what was working, stopped working, but it's important to emphasize it can be the other direction too. What didn't work before can start working as your health changes, as repair goes on, as things that were broken are then fixed. It's great. I'm very happy for people where that happens, because it means things have improved from where they were. You are now more tolerant than you were before, have more options, are in better health. All of those are good things.
And yeah, I think we just want to give some hope that, ketogenic diets, because I think a lot of people are like, my ketogenic diet saved my life. I don't want to stop doing my ketogenic. And I think you don't have to. If you want to, you can. And ultimately, I would just say it is possible to calorically restrict in a healthy way in a short-term period. Can't continuously do it and not have negative repercussions.
Yeah. And I think the other major point is listen to your body, because you will get feedback, even if some of it is subtle, even if you're not sure what it is, even if you're not sure what's causing it. Those are all things to pay attention to. If you feel great, if your body composition is great, if your blood work is great.
Right. And we all manage this in different ways, right? Like the program I run and the way that I do things is through what I call nutritional periodization, which means you have a period. If you're trying to lose body fat, you might have a short period, defined period where you're restricting in some way. To some people might fast more, or you just might calorically restrict for a period of time, but then you got to come out of it. You got to spend the majority of your time at maintenance or slightly above to try and push the metabolic threshold. I feel like, and I know we all do different approaches when we're trying to address our body fat, but that's my take on it, that you can't stay in a deficit forever, though you can visit.
A healthy person should be able to handle actually high energy loads, and it should translate into a desire to spend more energy. Like think about a little kid who you give them dinner and all the adults are sitting at the table chilling out, and the kid is like energized and has to run around the table. That's where I want to be.
Yeah. And like the other aspect of that is I do that too. Like sometimes I'll just be eating my normal high fat carnivorous diet. Sometimes I'll have high protein days. Other times I'll do a couple days of fat fasting if I feel like that sounds appealing. For those who are not aware, it's essentially just fat supplemented fasting. So I don't do water fasting. It doesn't really work for me anymore. So instead I just have only fat and nothing else for a couple of days, however long.
It's like, I'm like, okay, I'm done with this. The protein sparing modified fast.
Exactly.
Right.
I'm fat supplementing so that I don't accidentally run my resting metabolic rate into the ground, because my body does think I'm lean because of the lipedema, as far as I can tell. So
your
I give it a little extra.
Spare fat is lean.
I was thinking I might call it like resting metabolic rate sparing modified fasting, but that might be a little bit.
And then on the flip side, the protein sparing modified fast works great for some other people, but in short doses, right? I think the one thing I want to emphasize more than any other point is more, faster, harder weight loss. Do it double. If it's not working, push it faster, further. Get gung ho. Like that is long-term disastrous strategy.
Yeah. And that is another point.
Low carb is not part of that.
Yeah. The low carb is like immaterial.
Right. As long as if you're getting energy, you can do low carb for years, decades. It's going to be fine, but not in combination with low energy.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. I didn't even think to make it because I'm like, well, yeah, duh. Like that's not a thing. But I think the word keto, people have made, right? Because I said it, she said it, we all say it, right? Keto isn't working. What does that even mean? They mean my restrictive approach to trying to lose weight through what I think is the right way to do a ketogenic diet isn't working.
Right.
Yeah. Right. And I would agree with the video where doubling down on that, restricting more, fasting more, is not appropriate in that situation. Like sometimes the best thing to do is to go the opposite way.
Right.
And other people talk about this in terms of fasting, in terms of like all sorts of stuff. There is such a thing as doing things too much, in which case take a break, reverse diet, take a break from fasting, don't do alternate day fasting all the time, make sure you're properly refeeding, switch things up, whatever. If whatever you're doing isn't working, do something else. And that can be many different things.
Crazy, but true. Yeah. All right. I feel like we've done some really good work here, ladies.
I agree.
And I feel like it was important we were an all-female panel.
Yeah.
Yes. And all people who have been in this exact situation and agree, like, yes, this is important to talk about. Some people are inclined to ignore it because it's confusing and complex and frustrating. And if it doesn't fit with your worldview, you can want to shut it away in a little box. And that's not the way to go about it. Like, we have to openly talk about these things.
Right. And I think it feels good to be seen in your crisis, right? To see, oh, yes, I have that issue too. And I think the three of us felt very strongly that we want to say, like, there are many ways to fix this problem. And you don't have to be afraid because you didn't make a choice going keto that caused the problem. It's just a rearrangement of your mindset. I know that I'm going to get a little touchy-feely here, guys, but it's about a certain kindness to yourself.
Absolutely.
Right? Like a certain ability to say, oh, I can stop punishing myself for the body fat I have. This doesn't have to be hard and painful and drudgery and a slog. I don't have to think, well, I'm just not doing it hard enough if you're not seeing the fat loss you want to see. Dieting, caloric restriction, it is stressful. It is a known stressor to the body. You just can't load stress on stress on stress on stress. Ketogenic diet, not a stress, but how you go about it matters. And restricting energy too much for too long, you don't need to be that mean to yourself.
Yeah, I agree completely. And this is something I had to teach myself also, is like, we can go about improving health and talking about health and teaching people about health without shame, without shaming larger bodies, without shaming smaller bodies, without shaming anybody. We don't have to do that. We can talk about health in terms of having compassion for your body, in terms of being friends with your body. Catherine Seo, one of my colleagues, has this image and it makes me cry every single time. It's about this woman who's talking to her body and she says, I want to be your friend. And her body says back, I have been waiting for this my whole life. Like, that is the relationship that you want to have of, I want to work with you. I want to give you what you need. I don't want to punish you, because we both want the same thing. We want to be healthy and live a long, long, long time and feel great while doing that. That is the goal, not whatever else, not feeling sucky. No one wants to feel sucky, and no one has to, hopefully, or at least not for extended periods.
Right. Amber, do you have anything to close?
No, I think you're awesome.
I think you're awesome too.
I think everyone here is awesome.
And see, look, we have a higher carb eating girl over here. We got we have the low carb spectrum here. and so
we're on the spectrum, Kim.
Yes, I am. You know, and we did not include a high carb person here, but I feel like all of us say, if you want to eat more carbs, that is appealing to you, and you feel like you can do so responsibly. Because I have some clients who, when I told them they could have an extra cup of broccoli, they were like, and then I had a Krispy Kreme, right? So like, you have to know it's not just what it does to you metabolically, it's what it does to you psychologically. And you have to know your boundaries. But I think all of us would agree that for some people, even a high carb diet can be the answer. But ultimately, on any diet that is over calorically restricted, you're going to eventually see a good percentage of the population have problems.
Yeah. And I feel like at the very least, we had a higher carb representative here in this friendly discussion.
Yeah. I feel like, anyway. And the cat is there as well now.
Hey, cat. Oh yeah, that's Kiba.
Kiba. Okay. Thank you guys for joining us. I feel like this was a really fun time, and it was really nice to see you guys.
Yeah, good to see you too, Kim.
All right, we'll have to do this again because I figured out that our initials together spell ask. So like we have to have a show.
Whoa.
That's great. I love that.
All right, now the podcast begins. All right.
Yes, finally.
All right, ladies. Well, I will talk to you soon. Thank you for coming on.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Keto Life Support. Want more information? Want show notes? Want to suggest a topic? Just head over to ketolifesupport.com. That's where all that kind of thing can go on. By the way, I have a request. If you could go to your podcast host and hit subscribe, we would really, really appreciate it. And what would be even more awesome is if you could write a review. And what would be even more awesome than that is if you could write like a really flattering review. Just asking, you do you. All right. So thanks so much